The genesis of the Egyptian constitution of 1923. During the last year or so of Fuad's life, Sir David Kelly recounts in his memoirs, the King of Egypt, old and sick, would amuse himself by giving audiences to the British diplomat who was then acting High Commissioner at Cairo, in which he expressed himself with great frankness. The King, according to Kelly, showed great contempt for the intellectual qualities of the British. He said, as Sir David reported him, he understood the Italian, French, and German characters thoroughly, but had given up trying to make any sense of the actions of the British. He was especially bitter against the British for having imposed a constitution on the Belgian model on the Egyptians, who were completely unsuited for parliamentary government on those lines. Our interest in Egypt, he said, was purely strategic. Why had we not been content to leave him to run the country, as he may well knew how to do, if he would only cease interfering, providing that as his part of the bargain he played up on all matters affecting our strategic interest and empire communications. 7 years or so before these audiences, the United States minister gave an account of Fuad's opinions which also reflected his bitterness towards the British, and in particular towards Allenby, during whose time as High Commissioner, the Egyptian constitution which the king, according to Kelly, so disliked, had been promulgated. Fuad, so the American minister reported, found himself beset with difficulties. They were due, first, to the passion of the small minority of politically minded Egyptians for party politics, second, the desire of his ministers to get rich too quickly, and third, the difficulty of having always to placate and consider the British. The king then went on to discuss Allenby. Lord Allenby, he said, had the true soldier mind and was lacking in comprehension. He complained, the American minister went on, that even though Lord Allenby knew very little French, he would never have an interpreter, the result being that he frequently left the king, who does not speak English, seeming to have understood what His Majesty had said, and only later would it transpire that he had not understood at all. Allenby, in fact, knew French quite well, and Fuad's remarks are therefore significant in disclosing the king's reaction more to Allenby's mind and character than to his linguistic attainments. Fuad then seemed to think that those British with whom he had to deal but did not understand Egypt, and that Allenby in particular excelled in blundering obtuseness. It is also clear that the king's resentments were due to his belief that without British insistence, there would have been no constitution to give their opportunity to piddling and interested politicians and make his own life a misery. Fuad's lamentation should not move us overmuch, for if the constitution had been pressed on him by Allenby, it was because Allenby was High Commissioner. Allenby became High Commissioner because Sir Reginald Wingate had lost the confidence of his superiors in London. The loss of confidence was the consequence of agitation in Egypt, and the hidden instigator of that agitation had been Fuad himself. But whatever sympathy Fuad's predicament arouses, it is interesting to notice that his judgment was exactly identical to that of Allenby's successor in Egypt, for it was Lord Lloyd's view that the British had forced the parliamentary regime upon the country in the face of the king's wishes. To elucidate how this came about will throw some light on the subsequent vicissitudes of constitutional and representative government as it was attempted in Egypt between 1924 and 1952. When Lord Allenby compelled Lloyd George and his colleagues in February 1922 to agree to his solution of the Egyptian problem, he promised them that his proposals, if immediately accepted, will prove the basis of lasting settlement in Egypt. They proved to be nothing of the kind, and even Allenby's 3 remaining years as High Commissioner proved to be full of unsettlement, agitation, and unrest, culminating in the Sirdar's murder and the high-handed treatment to which the High Commissioner subjected the Egyptian government, a course of conduct which lost him the confidence of the Foreign Secretary and led to his resignation. Thus it may be said that Allenby's solution was really no solution. We may go further and say that it was this particular solution which was the breeding ground of later difficulties, that these later difficulties were part of the high price with which Allenby purchased the illusion of a lasting settlement. The declaration of the 28th of February 1922 purported to give Egypt her independence, with 4 reservations which generally concern the interests of Great Britain and the British Empire. The line of policy behind the declaration is intelligible and superficially attractive. Britain, so the reasoning went, had certain interests in Egypt, which were the real cause of her presence in the country. From 1882 to 1918, these interests were protected by Great Britain, actually occupying Egypt and closely supervising its administration. But the events of 1919 and of the following years had shown that the Egyptian official classes, at any rate, had ceased to acquiesce in British control, and without their acquiescence, Egypt was so ungovernable. The good government of Egypt, however, was not a direct British interest. If the Egyptian official classes wished to resume the government of their country, the British could have no objection, provided Egypt was compelled to recognise and secure British interests. hence the declaration and its four reservations. But if this was the reasoning behind the declaration, and only some such reasoning justified Allenby's claim, then it provided the basis of a lasting settlement. Why then, as Fawad asked in his conversations with Kelly, not leave well alone and be content to see Egypt governed by a king in the same manner as it had been governed by the Khedives? Or if it be argued that Egypt under British control had irrevocably changed from which it used to be under Said and Ismail, why not leave Egyptians themselves to deal with this change as best they could? Why should Allenby take it upon himself by sponsoring a constitution viciously to pose as the midwife of history? The answer is that in seeking to persuade London that his policy was the only feasible one, he had to make sure some Egyptian support, and that this committed him to, in turn, to support a constitution. For the Egypt which Allenby had to govern was not a crown colony, it was a protectorate with its own indigenous government, and the High Commissioner could not govern unless he could find Egyptians willing to take office as ministers. By the beginning of 1922, things had come to such a pass, the consequence of combined mismanagement by Allenby, Milner, and Lloyd George's government, that in order to escape from an impasse, Allenby had to strike a bargain with some Egyptian politicians. He confesses as much when he writes to Curzon that his proposals are a result of exhaustive negotiations with Sarwat Pasha and his immediate adherents. They, on their part, have been in contact with a wider circle, and Ali Pasha has been in close touch and has lent valuable and disinterested assistance. The support of these politicians was indispensable to Allenby, but he had to pay for it by supporting them in his turn with all the prestige and influence of the High Commissioner. Thus he found himself compelled to identify the Residency with a particular Egyptian faction, and consequently to alienate his rivals and enemies of his faction, namely Zaghloul and the King. Allenby found himself compelled to do this in order to get his declaration. The declaration was a voluntarily unilateral abandonment of the British position in Egypt. Being unilateral, it secured no concession in return, being obtained at the price of supporting one faction and alienating its enemies. It made British interest in Egypt the perpetual sport of Egyptian factions, and having forsworn control over Egyptian politics, the declaration made it difficult and at times quite impracticable for Great Britain to neutralise the factional disputes in which her interest became a pawn. This was the ruinous cost of Allenby's policy, which led his successor to write in 1927, "We have magnitude without position, power without authority, responsibility without control." This, true as it was when it was written, became even truer as the years went by. The declaration of the 28th of February, then, committed Allenby to Sarwat Pasha and his immediate adherents. What this commitment entailed may be gathered from a paragraph in the draft declaration which Allenby sent to London. This paragraph would have had the British government view with favour the creation of a parliament with right to control the policy and administration of a constitutional responsible government. This paragraph was amended in London, and the declaration, as finally published, did not commit the British government to the promotion of constitutionalism in a kingdom on which, by that very instrument, they were bestowing independence, but the absence of constitutionalist manifestos from the declaration of the 28th of February did not alter the fact that Farwat and his friends were now in power, supported by the great prestige and influence of the High Commissioner. They would naturally try to preserve and extend their power. In this enterprise, they had to guard against two enemies, Zaghloul with his Wafdist organisation and his power over the mob, and the king who imbued with the autocratic traditions of his house, and coming late in life and unexpectedly to the throne, was all the more rapacious for power and impatient of any who might claim to share it with him. In arguing that Farwat and his friends were primarily concerned to enjoy the power which their collaboration with Allenby had brought them, we do not mean to imply that they had no other purpose in politics. Farwat and his associates did, after all, stand for constitutionalism, the rule of law, and limited government. Among them were to be found the representatives and heirs of the pre-war Ummah Party, from which Cromer had hoped and expected so much. A sentence in the speech which Adli Yakan delivered on the 30th of October 1922, at the first general meeting of the Liberal Constitutionalist Party, which Farwat founded with his friends, may be taken to express their political hopes and ideals. The constitutional regime, he said, is the only form of government worthy of a nation such as ours, which is steeped in civilization. If, however, remember the extremely cavalier manner in which the Liberal Constitutionalists later treated the Constitution, we may fairly say that they insisted on a constitution in 1922 because it was then a convenient and useful instrument for limiting Fuad's power and consolidating their own. Their cooperation with Allenby seemed at first to have all the desirable results. Allenby had taken care to exile Zaghloul and his supporters from Cairo before coercing his own government into issuing the declaration of the 28th of February. and if the declaration did not contain the constitutional manifesto which Allenby had designed, yet the very fact that Allenby was supporting Farwat and his friends was enough, in the circumstances, to compel the king to give in to their desire for a constitution. The king, therefore, in appointing Farwat chief minister on the 1st of March 1922, requested him to prepare a draft constitution, and Farwat accepted office on the specific understanding that the constitution would ensure the responsibility of ministers to Parliament. On the 3rd of April, the Council of Ministers approved a memorandum by the Prime Minister setting up a constitutional commission composed of 30 members. The first paragraph embodies the terms on which Farwat took office and deserves quotation. The royal command to form a ministry, which was addressed to me, their memorandum declares, alluded to His Majesty's wish to bring about cooperation between the nation and the government by means of a constitutional regime, and charged the ministry with the preparation of a draft project. The answer of the ministry to the royal command was to the effect that it would immediately put in hand the preparation of a draft constitution in conformity with the principles of modern public law, and that such a constitution would lay down the principle of ministerial responsibility, thus affording to the representative assembly the right to supervise future political activity. The Commission of 30 which Farwat appointed was presided over by Hussein Rushdie Pasha. It included 4 ex-ministers, 9 members of the Legislative Assembly, which was prorogued in 1914, never to meet again, Shaykh Abd al-Hamid al-Bakri, head of the Sufi orders, Shaykh Mohammed Bakhit, an ex-Mufti of Egypt, 5 Copts including the Coptic Bishop of Alexandria, 1 Jew, representatives of the law, of commerce and of the Bedouins, the governors of Cairo and Alexandria, the Secretary-General of the Council of Ministers, and the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance. Of those who had played a part in the recent political events, Abd al-Latif al-Mukepadi presumably represented the Nationalist Party. Muhammad Ali Aluba and Abd al-Aziz Fahmy had first cooperated with Zaghloul in 1919-20, had broken with him over his devious methods and dictatorial habits, and were now associated with Adli and Farwat, whilst Ali Mahir, who had also been associated with the Wafd, organising a civil servant strike in 1919, did now seem to be identified with any group, but pursued in the Commission an individual and most interesting line of argument. As for the Wafd, they flatly refused to have anything to do with the Constitutional Commission, which Zaghloul denounced as the Malefactors Commission, Lajnat al-Ahikia, alleging that a constitution was properly business not of a commission, but of a constituent assembly. Zaghloul's tactics are easily appreciated. He was on the one hand boycotting and blackening a body created by his political rivals, while on the other, the demagogical powers, which he had successfully tested on the Egyptian masses, made him confident of controlling an elected constituent assembly. The commission was ably assisted by a secretariat of legal experts and draftsmen. The Commission then seems to be well balanced in affording representation to different interests and sections. Its members collectively possessed a respectable body of political wisdom and legal expertise. Most of them were traditional and conservative in their views. Their attitude to constitutional making may perhaps be summed up by the remark of a member who, the American charge d'affaires reported, said to me, anent the difficulty scholarly Arabic employed, that incidentally he had the advantage that des petits gens would not be able to understand it, but if this may be said to reflect the attitudes of the majority, it certainly does not represent that of the few members who took an active and prominent part in the discussions. These included Abd al-Latif al-Mukibati, Abd al-Aziz Fahmy, Ali Mahir, and Abd al-Hamid Badawi, the Secretary-General of the Council of Ministers. Ali Mahir, in particular, took an extreme radical, populist and anti-monarchical line in which he was occasionally seconded, it is interesting to note, by Shaykh Mohammed Bakhit, the ex-Mufti, and which was quite remarkable in its contrast to his future career as a kingsman. Discussions extending over many sittings ranged over the most fundamental principles of government, and different views and opinions were defended with spirit, learning, and not a little ingenuity. Thus there were long debates over the right of the king to veto legislation, to dissolve the parliament and to preside over the cabinet, debates over the status of the royal household officials, over the proportion of elected and appointed senators, and whether the president of the Senate should be elected by his peers or appointed by the king. There were other debates on matters equally fundamental, but the topics just mentioned have proved in retrospect to be the most significant and to have given rise to the many vicissitudes which Egyptian constitutionalism suffered in its short and checkered history. Acute controversy occurred at the very first meeting of the Commission. Abd al-Latif al-Mukibati and Abd al-Aziz Fahmy stood for a franchise embracing all Egyptians over 21. Ismail Abaza, a notable who had been a member of the Legislative Assembly, opposed this suggestion, saying that he could not imagine how a peasant who merely tilled the earth and did not know how to read and write could be considered the equal of, say, Abdelaziz Fahmy or of himself. Those in favour of universal suffrage buttressed their contention by the argument that equality of burdens entailed equality of rights, and that since the peasant was subject to conscription, his right to vote was beyond dispute. Their opponents, however, argued that the vote was, as Haeckel puts it, part of the process of government, Amalia min Amaliyat al-Hukum, on which depended the choice of representatives, who by their expression of confidence in the cabinet made its continuance in power possible. It followed, therefore, according to his view, that some acquaintance with political issues and some informed interest in the operation of government was required from the voter. The debate, as may be appreciated, raised issues of principle which, if not speedily resolved in some fashion, threatened to prolong deliberations intolerably. The chairman, Hussein Rushdie, acted quickly. At the second meeting, after a prolonged debate, he succeeded in having appointed a subcommittee of 18 members who were charged with formulating the basis on which the constitution ought to rest. The smaller numbers made the subcommittee more manageable, but here too issues of principle continued to be raised and debated with skill and pertinacity. The main dispute within the subcommittee lay between those who wanted to give the monarch some real powers and those who wanted to function to be merely ceremonial. According to Haeckel, Hussein Rushdie played a critical part in these debates. Rushdie Pasha, he writes, was the real motive force behind its activity. He got up in advance the subjects to be debated. He intervened frequently in the debates and used the authority of the chair to adjourn the debate whenever it threatened to produce undesirable decisions. Haeckel describes Rushdie's attitude with some precision. Notwithstanding his acceptance of public liberties and indeed his warm defence of them, writes Haeckel, Rushdie Pasha inclined to concede certain rights to the monarch. Some people have expressed surprise at such an attitude in a man who had studied in France and had been particularly known for his courage and his preference for liberty. It seems to me that in these discussions the man was not defending a view in which he believed, but rather a policy which he was convinced was the only one to ensure the realisation of the greatest part of the Commission's aims. The policy depended on the fact that whatever was produced by the Commission was no more than a draft constitution which, in order to take effect, had to be ratified by the monarch. If, therefore, such a draft deprived by the monarch of all power, then it would be subject to radical revision, but if, on the other hand, satisfaction were given to the monarch on some issues, or basic rights were secured to the nation and its representatives, then it was most probable that nothing would prevent the draft constitution from being promulgated. Haeckel goes on to say that these considerations were also very much in the minds of those members of the Commission who were most in contact with Farwat and his ministry. Two other motives, Haeckel thought, further explained Rushdie's policy. The first, that with the constitutional issue out of the way, Egypt could begin to tackle Great Britain on the four reserved points of the Declaration of the 28th of February. The second, that if it came to contest between moderates and extremists, as happened when Adli and Zaghloul clashed in the spring of 1921, a monarch with some effective constitutional power would exert his influence in favour of the moderates. If this was really in Rushdie's mind, the events which followed the promulgation of the constitution must have soon undeceived him. The draft constitution produced by the Commission was, then, a compromise between Fuad's desire for unfettered power and the views of those on the Commission who stood for an unfettered popular sovereignty. It was largely a codification and abridgment of constitutional practices and traditions which had grown up in Europe since the Middle Ages, which had been digested, summarised and transformed into principles of public law by the academic lawyers, mainly French, from whom members of the Commission derived much of their constitutional learning. The draft began by asserting Article 23 that all authority derives from the nation, went on to divide governmental powers into a legislative, to be exercised by Parliament in conjunction with the King, an executive of which the king was the head, and a judiciary. Executive power was to be exercised under the king by council of ministers who were to resign from office on forfeiting the legislature's confidence. The king had a limited right of veto over legislation, Articles 33 and 34, the power to dissolve a parliament, Article 36, and the power to appoint and dismiss ministers, Article 45. The Commission published a commentary to accompany the draft, in which they explained that the right of dissolution was essential as a means of effecting a balance between the executive and the legislative, enabling the nation to be consulted whenever there was a deadlock between the different powers in the state. The commentary also supplied a gloss on Article 45, which gave the king power to appoint and dismiss ministers, saying that the current convention was that the king chose the prime minister and, on his advice, appointed and dismissed ministers. This, then, was a model, a textbook constitution, sage comme une image, full of checks and of balances, and ordered an intricate toyland in which everything was calm and beauty. Its radical failing in the actual conditions of Egyptian politics was that it assumed and took for granted that elections in Egypt could possibly elicit, as they did elsewhere, the will of the electorate. As the sequel from 1923 to 1952 showed, they did nothing of the kind. Egyptian elections, rather, proved to be ratifications by the masses of decisions taken by the king, or else by the Cairo politicians. Depending on which side had, for the time being, the upper hand, dissolutions, therefore, could not remotely help, as the Commission expected in preserving the balance of the Constitution, and their judicious and elaborate considerations merely managed to look ineffective and academic. This is also the case with the gloss on Article 45 dealing with the appointment and dismissal of ministers. The Commission took for granted that a Prime Minister would be appointed only if he had a majority in the Parliament, and fastened on the insignificant issue of the appointment and dismissal of other ministers. In fact, the clause in the draft giving the King powers to appoint and dismiss ministers, including, of course, the Prime Minister, was passed on the nod in the General Commission. The Commission did not consider the possibility that the King might make a literal use of his powers and appoint and dismiss his chief ministers as he liked, but this is what, in fact, repeatedly happened under the parliamentary regime in Egypt. Given these conditions, the parliamentary regime which Farwat and his friends desired and which Allenby was inclined to press on the king could not but justify Cromer's foreboding when at the end of his long rule in Egypt he affirmed that, under the specious title of free institutions, the worst evils of personal government would reappear. Rushdie's judicious policies and his tenacious attempts at compromise availed nothing, for even if by some miracle he had succeeded in reconciling royal ambitions with constitutional government, he would yet have been powerless to endow an Egyptian parliament with representativeness, or to make possible limited government in a country where unlimited power was, and continued to be, a standing temptation, easy to fall into and safe to indulge. Therefore, we may say that by supporting parliamentarianism in Egypt, Allenby was engaging his credit and the credit of his government in support of a farce. For him, it was not even a profitable farce. One of the points which the declaration of the 28th of February absolutely reserved to the discretion of the British government was the Sudan, then administered as an Anglo-Egyptian codominium. The Constitutional Commission decided that the forthcoming constitution should indicate unmistakably that Fawad was king of both Egypt and the Sudan. Such a proposal was defended alike by those who were the king's partisans and by those who wished to challenge British power in the Nile Valley. When Allenby came to hear of this proposal, he objected strenuously, but in spite of the fact that Farwat and his friends were in office owing to British support, his protests availed him nothing, and the draft constitution, when it was completed and handed to Farwat, stated in Article 29 that the king shall be called King of Egypt and the Sudan. The fact in that, however much Rushdie, Farwat, and their friends may have disliked this provision, they had no means of opposing it without giving the king and Zaghloul a powerful pretext for attacking them as creatures of the British government. Haikal tells us that Farwat consulted Adley and his other political friends who advised him that the provision had to stand. Allenby used to complain that Adley was a broken reed and that he had much preferred to deal with Farwat. And it is true that Adley was not a fighter, but in this particular case it was Farwat who let Allenby down, and could not do so otherwise if he wanted to stay in power. The episode merely shows that the policy which Allenby thought was worth coercing his government into following was of pretty little use in the defence of British interests, and that as hitherto British interests had to be defended by constant British intervention, which after the declaration of the 28th of February could be, and was, legitimately denounced as interference. Hussein Rushdie could be as statesmanlike and moderate as he liked, but there was no disguising the fact that the draft constitution, however solicitous of the king's prerogative, represented a serious limitation of his powers, for Fawad did not mean to be reduced to a constitutional monarch so that Farwat and his friends might enjoy greater patronage and power. The royal palace was traditionally a power in the land, and so long as a constitution was not promulgated, the king retained vast powers of initiative, intervention, and patronage, which Fawad proceeded to wield for the undoing of his chief minister. During the summer of 1922, Fawad made clear his disapproval of Farwat and his policies, and the ministry's supporters within the Constitutional Commission tried to make haste to complete their labours. A subcommittee was appointed to produce the final draft of the Constitution, and another subcommittee to produce the final draft electoral law. The texts were at last agreed, and 6 months after beginning its work, the Commission presented to them Farwat on the 21st of October. By then, the Prime Minister's position was gravely weakened both by his disagreement with Allenby over the Sudan and by the King's manifest disapproval. One of Fuad's tactics now was to adopt a popular stance and insist that Farwat should obtain from the British the recall of Zaghloul, the People's Tribune, and of his friends from exile to which they had been sent in December 1921, precisely in order that Farwat might assume office unhindered. There is again a coolness between Sarwat, the Prime Minister, and the King, reported the American Charge d'Affaires on the 2nd of October, due to a difference of opinion relative to the policy pursued with the Zaghloul leaders. The King is afraid of their enmity and is for leniency. This Sarwat regards as weakness and opposes. The language of this telegram indicates not so much the King's actual motives as the impression which he desired outsiders to gather. The architect of this policy would seem to have been Tawfiq Nassim, a former Prime Minister who since April 1922 was Chief of the Royal Cabinet. It appears that he managed to achieve an understanding between the King and Zaghlul's party, which was presumably directed against the existing ministry. The upshot of these manoeuvres was that the Wafd began to attack Farwat's administration even more strongly and to abound in fervent declarations of loyalty to the throne. In the telegram of the 2nd of October previously cited, the American Charge d'Affaires reported that Farwat was then unpopular and that his administration could not last for long. It is, in effect, he added, imposed upon the country by measures taken or supported under martial law. The observation is correct and applies not only to the last days of Farwat's administration, but in fact to the whole of it. It had been brought in and supported by British power, but that truth should now be openly said about it indicated that its days were numbered. In the event, Farwat lasted until the end of November. The coup de grace was delivered with the help of another household official, Hassan Nashat, whose role in Egyptian politics had hitherto been obscure, but who was to play a part of some importance in the following years. The king, attended by Farwat and his other ministers, was to go to Al-Azhar for Friday prayers on the 1st of December. Nashat distributed money among the Azhar students and incited them to demonstrate against Farwat on the occasion of the royal visit. Farwat heard of this plot, and rather than be subjected to the indignity of such a contrived attack, preferred to send in his resignation the day before. Nashat brought Farwad's acceptance within the hour. Allenby told the American minister how sorry he was at Farwat's fall, and heavily remonstrated with the king for his actions, informing him of the displeasure of the British government at his treatment of a minister who had been appointed to implement the policy of the declaration. Tawfiq Nassim, the new Prime Minister, had two assignments: to try to make the constitution as innocuous as possible, while maintaining the provision of Article 29, which assured to Fawad the dual monarchy of Egypt and the Sudan. This latter object was, of course, impossible to achieve in the face of British objections. Allenby had protested against the offending article when Farwat was in power, but may have found his style cramped by his desire to support him. Such considerations now no longer inhibited Allenby, and he coerced the king into signing a declaration giving up these pretensions. We do not know the exact tenor of this declaration, but Allenby's threat seems to have been to the effect that if Fawad persisted in his claim, he would have to give up the Egyptian throne not only for himself, but for his heir as well. Fawad signed the declaration at the beginning of February 1923, and according to Allenby, Tawfiq Nassim felt as a result that he could not continue in office. He resigned on the 9th of February, the king denouncing him as a coward. During his period of office, rumours began rife that the palace and the ministry had amended the constitution drastically, and that the clause stating that the nation was the source of authority was to be omitted, that the king was to be given wide prerogatives in the distribution of honours, the dissolution of parliament and not merely the Chamber of Deputies as the draft proposed, and in the control of religious endowments, and that he was to have the power of issuing decree laws even when the parliament was sitting, and that the proportion of senators appointed by the king was to be greatly increased. The liberal constitutionalists and Abd al-Aziz Fahmy, in particular, were loud in their protests. Tawfiq Nassim resigned before any amendments were officially published, but that drastic changes had been made to conform to Fuad's wishes is not in doubt. It did not prove easy to appoint a successor to Tawfiq Nassim. Adli Yakan was approached to form an administration. It would seem at Allenby's instance, but the political situation which he confronted was complicated and treacherous in the extreme. Under Tawfiq Nassim's inspiration, the king's policy had been, from the summer of 1922 onwards, to encourage Zaghlul's Wafd to maintain popular effervescence against Farwat and his British patrons. By means of demonstrations and terrorist outrages, these outrages continued unchecked under Tawfiq Nassim's administration. These tactics are clearly exhibited in a letter from Tawfiq Nassim in answer to a protest by Allenby against the murder of Mr. Robson, a lecturer at the Law College. Tawfiq Nassim asserted that such outrages indicated that British policy did not take into account the sentiments of the majority, which had been further exacerbated by an understanding reached between the British and a minority which had no real influence over the nation. Thus, Allenby the Bull was baited and ridiculed for the ill success of his famous declaration. When Adley was asked to form a cabinet, he realised that if he succeeded, it would be in the teeth of determined and concerted opposition from the King and the Zagloists. He had had experience, when Prime Minister in 1921, of the lengths to which Zagloists would go in demagogy and excitement, and had no stomach for another such experience. This is what Allenby meant when he said that Adley was a broken reed. In the manner usual to broken reeds, Adley thought to escape his difficulties by a compromise. He would take office only on condition that the Waft supported him, let Zaghloul and his friends be recalled from exile, and in return let the constitution as drafted by the Commission be promulgated. Since Fawad's object was precisely to prevent this, and since the Wafdists had no desire to see their rival in power, much less support him, this compromise plan was quite useless. To help Adley see things as they really were, Wafdist incitement and terrorist outrages were stepped up. In these activities, it seems that Hassan Nashat was so implicated that the British required his departure from Egypt and refused to let him return until the constitution was finally promulgated. Adley was told that he could have office with the King's approval if he agreed to issue the amended draft as a constitution. He preferred to give up the attempt. A cabinet was not formed until the 15th of March. The Prime Minister was Yahya Ibrahim, who was not a political personality and presumably acceptable both to Allenby and to the King. He was not of a calibre to stand up to either, but was merely the intermediary whose function was to prevent a direct clash between them. The King, we understand from Allenby's biography, had not abandoned his opposition to the draft constitution, and the High Commissioner thought it judicious to use his influence with him, and accordingly advised him to allow himself to be guided by his own Prime Minister. Allenby's constitutional tuition lasted for a month before the King allowed himself to be converted and to promulgate the constitution on the 19th of April. In a report quoted by his biographer, Allenby states that Fawad's behaviour was running counter to unanimous and clearly expressed public opinion, and that he intervened because it was not in accord with the policy of the declaration, that the King should arrogate undue powers to himself, and because he wished to avoid a constitutional struggle between the King and people. As regards public opinion and the possibility of a struggle between the King and people, there is no evidence to support Allenby's contentions. It is true that the King's ambitions were attacked, but only by the handful of politicians and academics who dreamed of a constitutional representative government for their country. As late as 15th of April, 4 days before the promulgation of the Constitution, Abdelaziz Fahmy was addressing an open letter to the Prime Minister, protesting against certain Egyptians offering the results of the anti-British struggle as a free gift to the royal house. Yahi Bunaha, Ghanima, Barada, Li Umara, Al-Bayt al-Malik. But such protests, noble and courageous as they may have been, were not the voice of unanimous and clearly expressed public opinion. They were on the contrary to the voice of a minority of politicians who, Abdelaziz Fahmy expected by their later actions, showed that their regard for constitutionalism speedily disappeared at the prospect of power. Again, Allenby was mistaken in thinking that an autocratic constitution would have precipitated a struggle between king and people. It might have precipitated a struggle between the king and Allenby's clients. But this is another story. As for Allenby's remaining motive, i.e., that the king's behaviour was contrary to the policy of the declaration, it is most revealing. Allenby does not, and of course cannot, say that such behaviour was contrary to the declaration. There was nothing in the declaration to show that Fawad had to be a constitutional figurehead, scrupulous in observing the proprieties, content merely to be consulted, to advise and to warn. The policy of the declaration is another matter altogether, and really signifies the assumptions on which Allenby had built his policy. Fawad was under no obligation to make these assumptions come true. Allenby, as a constitutional mentor, calls to mind the observations of a witty Orientalist on the behaviour of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun, trying to force theological dogmas down the throats of his unwilling divines. C'est un libéral, wrote dans Menstetter of him. C'est-à-dire qu'il envoya les orthodoxes à la potence, mutatis mutandis. The description fits the methods of Allenby, the constitutionalist, to perfection. The Constitution, promulgated on the 19th of April, differed in many ways from the draft completed the previous October. The extent of the King's original demands may be imagined from the wide prerogatives which this document still secured to him even after a month of powerful pressure from Allenby. Article 23, which asserted that the nation was the source of authority, meant in the constitution in spite of the fears of the liberal constitutionalists, but it was glossed with a curious commentary from the Minister of Justice, Ahmad Dukul Fakar. This principle that the nation is the origin of all authority, stated his explanatory memorandum issued with the constitution, is not in contradiction with the origin of the Islamic monarchical and absolutist governments, because these monarchies used initially to depend on the explicit or implicit consent of the people, represented by its elders and notables. The theory is not really tenable, but its effect is to substitute an autocratic interpretation for the democratic one, intended by the original authors of the Article 23. The modifications introduced in the Constitution itself were of greater importance, however, than the merely academic dispute about the proper meaning of Article 23. The Constitution gave the King power to confer civil and military rank, decorations and titles at his own discretion. It gave him power to appoint and dismiss military officers and diplomats. The Constitution also increased significantly the proportion of appointed senators and made the presidency of the Senate an office within the sole discretion of the monarch to bestow. Again, it left religious endowments and the control of the Muslim religious institutions solely within the power of the king until the parliament should legislate otherwise. The draft also had specifically entrenched 8 articles against amendment or abrogation, while the constitution was much more vague in stating that no proposal could be entertained which would change the provisions guaranteed by this constitution concerning the representative form of government, the order of succession to the throne, and the principles of liberty and equality. The king then got what he wanted, in part at least, but in order to get it he had to enlist the help of Zaghloul and his wafdists, for which of course they exacted a price. The price was the king's support in gaining power. The extent to which Fawad was involved with Zaghloul at that time may be gathered from the fact that at his first interview as Prime Minister with the High Commissioner, Yahya Ibrahim, who himself had no Wafdist connections, asked Allenby to allow Zaghloul and his companions to come back from their exile. Egypt was at last endowed with a constitution and an electoral law. Elections had therefore to be held, and when they were, at the end of 1923, the weight of administrative influence was exerted against the liberal constitutionalists, and therefore in favour of Wafdists. Zaghloul enjoyed a crushing majority and was appointed Prime Minister. Later, Fawad used to justify his behaviour in supporting Zaghloul at this juncture by claiming that it was a far-sighted scheme for breaking the popular idol, burdening him with responsibility. But when he had held this conversation, Fawad was surely sighing with relief that Zaghloul's ineptitude in his failure to control the terrorist apparatus had accidentally rid him of a prime minister whom his own machinations had brought to power, and who, when he unexpectedly fell, was bidding fair to overwhelm with a populist dictatorship Fawad's own autocracy.